criminal trial, which is, let's say, a typical average criminal trial, which takes place in our courts all across our country. Uh, I'm assuming that all of you know understand what is an FIR, and because FIR is the most common way in which criminal law is sent into motion. So once criminal law is set into motion, then obviously law takes its own course and goes all the way up to the conviction or the acquittal, whatever may be the case. But FIR is the starting point of a particular criminal law offense. So I will take an example in which, let us say, there is an accused person who is accused of killing his friend. Killing his friend not by way of murder, but let's say by way of homicide, not amounting to murder, culpable homicide, not amounting to murder. So I'll in fact talk about one of the cases which I'm handling. I'm handling this case where two friends were sitting on one particular night and they were drinking. They were having a good time. They were drinking somewhere in East Delhi. When one of the friends, there was some reason for an altercation between the two of them, and because of that altercation, it eventually led to a heated fight between the two of them, in which, at the end of that verbal fight, one of the friends slapped the other friend, and the other friend actually fell on the ground, got such a serious injury in the head that he succumbed after serving 2 days in the hospital. So let's say that this is the example on which we will be talking about the entire scheme of CRPC, and the entire kind of way in which the CRPC functions and the life of a criminal trial. So what happened was that, let's say X and Y were the two friends in my example, and X was the one who died. So as soon as X died, as soon as Y slapped X and X fell on the ground and got severe injury, the relatives of Y came over. The relatives of X came over, and they took X to the hospital. At the same time, what the relatives of X did was that they went to a police station and lodged an FIR, what is called a first information report. Now, one thing which I need to clarify at the outset here is that an FIR can only be lodged if it is a cognizable offense. Now, what do I mean by cognizable offense? I'm assuming that as we speak, or as we understand this lecture, we all have our CRPC with us. And even if you don't, I would just quickly refer to the sections. You can write them down, and then I will try and give the crux of the entire scheme of CRPC within this one and a half hours, whatever time it takes. So if you would notice that cognizable offense is defined under CRPC, and usually, if memory serves me right, there is a certain sentence threshold that if a particular offense carries sentence more than a particular amount of years, then it will be cognizable offense. Otherwise, it will be a non-cognizable offense. The important point that I want to draw here is that every cognizable offense is an offense in which an FIR can be lodged. An FIR cannot be lodged for a non-cognizable offense. Now, obviously, in this case, it wasn't a cognizable offense because culpable homicide not amounting to murder carries a lot of punishment, carries a very lengthy punishment, very lengthy sentence. So, in this case, since X was the one which was hurt, therefore, relatives of X lodged the FIR, and the FIR was lodged, let us say, on 2nd January 2020. That is the date of the FIR. Now, everyone, please note down one judgment right away. That is the judgment of Lalita Kumari. If you've not read it, you should read it. The judgment basically says that if there is a cognizable offense which is made out by way of a complaint, then in all such cases, the police station is bound. The police station is bound to lodge an FIR. The police station cannot decline to lodge an FIR. Now, you need to appreciate there is a difference between a criminal complaint and an FIR. A criminal complaint essentially is something which you give in writing. So let's say in this case, the relatives of X will give in writing to the police station where this offense has occurred that, there was Y, and Y, in the heat of the moment slapped X, because of which, X got hurt and eventually died. So that will be a criminal complaint. That will not be an FIR. Please remember, this is a very important distinction, and especially before you start practicing law, a lot of law students make this have this problem of confusing the two. Criminal complaint is separate from an FIR. In a lot of cases, even after the coming of Lalita Kumari judgment, the police station does not lodge an FIR because they think that the complaint is mala fide, the complaint is, not out of bona fide beliefs. So in all such cases, the criminal complaint is taken by the officer at the police station, usually the front desk or the SHO for that matter, and not converted into an FIR. They don't lodge an FIR on that. They just take the criminal complaint and keep it with them, which as per Lalita Kumari's judgment is not allowed, because if there is a cognizable offense which can be made out, then an FIR has to be lodged. So let's say in this case the FIR was lodged correctly as per the Lalita Kumari's judgment. Then what happens after the FIR is lodged? The next thing which happens after the FIR is lodged, that there is a right to arrest without a warrant, which comes in favor, which comes to the power of arrest comes to the investigating officer. Now you see, as soon as the FIR is lodged in the police station, there is an investigating officer which is appointed. That investigating officer is the person who is responsible for conducting the entire investigation with regard to the offense which has been committed. So as soon as the FIR is lodged, this police officer, who is the investigating officer in the FIR, gets the power to arrest. Now that is a very, very kind of a strong power, and the CRPC, by way of its latest amendments, read with the judgments of the Supreme Court, have also very well, caveated this power. They have kind of, circumscribed this power, because now the CRPC, along with some of the Supreme Court judgments, very clearly say that the arrest or the power to arrest by the investigating officer can only be exercised under certain circumstances. Now, what are those circumstances? So if you would have a look at section 41 of the CRPC, the scheme of section 41 delineates and creates two classes of offenses. Those two classes being offenses in which the punishment is 7 years or above, and offenses in which the punishment is 7 years and less. If the punishment of that particular offense is 7 years and less, then there are certain conditions which the investigating officer will have to fulfill before going ahead and arresting the accused person. Now, what are those conditions? Those conditions are mentioned in (41A) subclause 2. So if you'll see 41A subclause 2, it mentions the cases in which, just one second, I'll give you the correct section. Yes, it is 41A subclause, 41B subclause 2, 41(1)B subclause 2, which talks about certain conditions which are mandatory for the police officer to ensure when the offense is of a particular nature. So essentially the point that I'm trying to make is that the powers of arrest are not unbridled. The powers of arrest are only unbridled when the offense actually carries more than 7 years of imprisonment. If it carries more than 7 years of imprisonment, then you are looking at a much kind of a higher power where the investigative officer can just go and arrest the accused. But if the offense carries punishment which is less than 7 years, then in all such cases, the officer will have to have reasons to believe that the crime was committed by the accused person, and will also have to, demonstrate by writing in his or her case diary as to what are the grounds on which, he or she can go and arrest. Also, it's important for me to point out here that just one second, I'll just open a particular row. It's also important for me to point out here that in a lot of police stations and in a lot of states, there are also certain mandatory guidelines which clearly mention that arrest can only be done by a particular police officer after taking the permission from the senior. So it essentially means that if, and especially these are with regard to, cases of, let's say, dowry which carries 3 years of punishment, or cases which have a civil tone to it, which is not exactly purely criminal. In such cases, without taking the permission of, let's say, the DCP or the ACP of the concerned jurisdiction, the investigating officer cannot effect an arrest. All of you would appreciate that, there is a lot of corruption in the Indian police, and in fact in the Indian judiciary. It will be wrong for me to say that only the Indian police is corrupt. The judiciary is no less corrupt in any case. But the point that I'm trying to make is that it is very important for the Supreme Court to lay such guidelines, because otherwise the power of arrest is very often abused. And in a lot of cases, these arrests are made on the basis of the bribes that they receive. And hence, the Supreme Court has, reiterated the guidelines again and again. Now, I'll quickly, just refer to the notes. 41(1)(b), yeah, I was correct. So it's 41(1)(b), which lays down the conditions. One judgment which you can note is Rajesh Sharma versus Rajesh Sharma case, AIR 2017 SC 3869. AIR 2017 SC 3869. Anyone who may be interested in this subject, in the concept of arrest, in light of this particular provision, should read this. Now, where have we reached? What X was slapped by Y. X got admitted to the hospital. He died. There was an FIR which was lodged. Now, what happens after the lodging of an FIR? The investigating officer, let us say, goes and arrests X, Y. After the investigating officer goes and arrests Y, the investigating officer needs to complete the investigation as per section 167 within 60 or 90 days. 60 days if the punishment which is being carried is less than 10 years, I believe, and 90 days if the punishment is more than 10 years. I'll just check this as well. This is strictly as per 167 2A, which is an amendment which was brought out in 1978. So, this is for 10 years. Yeah, correct. So, in this case, since the offense which is committed carries punishment of more than 10 years, therefore this clearly and squarely falls within the 90-day time period. So investigating officer will be obliged to complete the investigation within 90 days. If the investigating officer does not complete the investigation within 90 days, then the accused here would be entitled to something which is called default bail. It is called default bail under law, and that default bail is under 167(2) of the CRPC. Again, a very, very important provision. You all should note this down and remember it. Default bail operates when the investigating officer is not able to complete and file the charge sheet within time of as prescribed under 167. Now, you see, the police does not have to file a charge sheet in all cases. The police can very well file a closure report. If the police feels that the offense has not been committed by the accused person, then in all such cases, the police can very well file a closure report saying that there is no valid offense which is being made out. And after investigation, the investigating officer is fairly sure that the offense was not committed by the accused person, and therefore a closure report has to be filed. Usually, we will see that in physical offenses, in offenses relating to the body, in bodily crimes, closure reports are not filed. It is the charge sheet which is filed. But in a lot of white collar offenses, in a lot of offenses where CBI is investigating or the ED is investigating, ED would obviously investigate under the special procedure, but CBI investigating under the CRPC, as per the provision of the CRPC, they file closure reports because they think that, at the end of it all, the complaint was motivated and it only had a civil overtone to it, not having any criminality as such. So we are now at 173. Let us say the police in this case files a charge sheet against Y, saying that Y did commit culpable homicide not amounting to murder. Y is charge sheeted. The charge sheet is filed by the investigating officer before the competent magistrate of that jurisdiction. That magistrate of the jurisdiction will take cognizance of this offense under section 190. Section 190 also is a very, very important provision of the CRPC. Please take note of that. After the cognizance is taken by the magistrate under 190, the magistrate will send this case, will commit this case under section 209. So what happens is usually when the charge sheet is filed, and let us say in this case the offense was on 2 January 2020, the FIR was on 2 January 2020, the arrest was on 5 January 2020, and charge sheet was filed on, let us say, 4th April 20, not 4th, let's say 2nd of April 2020, the charge sheet was filed before the magistrate. Now, when the magistrate receives this charge sheet, the magistrate can do three things. The magistrate can either take cognizance on the basis of what the investigating officer has investigated and agree with the findings of the investigating officer. The magistrate can also say that, listen, I don't agree with your conclusions. I don't agree with, the way in which you've investigated the offense. So therefore, you further investigate. You investigate more, and then probably come back to me with a more detailed report. Or the magistrate can simply decline taking any kind of cognizance on this particular offense and say that he's convinced that a closure report should have been filed, and therefore he does not want to proceed with the case. Now, someone has has sent a comment saying that I should discuss 156 as well. I think that's a very useful comment. In fact, I had written about that on my note as well. So 156 is a alternative route in which, when the police station does not lodge an FIR, then the aggrieved complainant, or let us say the relatives of the deceased in this place, can go before the appropriate magistrate of that jurisdiction and file a application under section 156(3), saying that this is a case in which a cognizable offense has been committed, and therefore the police is wrongly not investigating the crime, not lodging an FIR and investigating a crime. Hence, the magistrate may give a direction to the local police and the police station to lodge an FIR and investigate. Now, interestingly, before you go under 156(3), it is very important for you to write to the SP of that concerned area, which is the superintendent of police, saying that, please, the FIR is not being lodged, and because the FIR is not being lodged, therefore the SP should take, consideration of the matter and probably lodge an FIR if the SP deems fit. Now, obviously, in such cases, sometimes the SP does not even reply because of the multifarious tasks that he's usually, expected to discharge. And therefore, in all those cases, it will be the court which will, give a direction if the court deems fit that the complainant has been able to show enough material to show that, there is a cognizable offense which has been committed. One more very important point is that there is another third way of invoking criminal law, and that is a private complaint. In that private complaint, you just don't go through the police machinery at all. You directly file a complaint under section 200 before the magistrate, and you have to, bring in your witnesses. And by you, I mean the complainant. The complainant has to bring in his or her own witnesses, and directly the magistrate can take cognizance under 190, which is also, a way of invoking or setting in motion the criminal law remedy. But usually we see that in physical offenses, in bodily crimes, in crimes carrying serious punishments, it is the FIR route which is taken, either the FIR route or the 156.3 route, which ultimately leads to an FIR route, which is taken by the complainants. So that was 156.3. Now, one more important thing about 156.3 is that in a lot of cases, the magistrate will not entertain your 156.3 if the magistrate feels that you can always make out a case in section 200. The magistrate can say that, listen, I don't see the reason why police should investigate this, because anyways all the documents are there in public domain, or let us say all the events which have taken place are there in public domain, and therefore police investigation is not required. Police is a resource which is which we have to use in a very judicious way, and therefore you please go under section 200 and give your complaint and lead your pre-summoning evidence, bring in your witnesses, and get the magistrate to order for cognizance. So that is that. We've reached to 190. Now what happens after the magistrate court takes cognizance of a charge sheet? Now in this case, let us say the magistrate court says that, okay, fine, yes, we agree with the findings of the IO. We do think that the offense was committed by Y, and therefore we will issue summons to Y. Now the magistrate can do 2 or 3 things. If the magistrate knows that the accused is behind the bars till the time the charge sheet is filed, then in those cases the magistrate will get the accused produced from the jail and the accused will continue to be in the jail, because obviously now the default bail provision will not come in, because the charge sheet has been filed within time before the expiry of 90 days, and therefore the detention of the accused will continue. And in such cases, the accused will be present before the court of law on every date of trial, unless he or she has got a bail. So, and usually bail is very tough during the trial time. It usually in murder and homicide and rape cases, you don't end up getting the bail before the trial is over. The entire trial is over. Obviously, there are cases of exception, but in case where there is enough prima facie evidence, in such cases, bail is very difficult to secure. So now, after the magistrate takes cognizance, produces the accused from the jail, or in cases where, let us say, the accused was never arrested in the first place. Let us say there was a case in which, in this case, Y was not arrested. The police thought that they don't want to arrest the accused. They will just, file a charge sheet without arresting the accused, only by taking statements from the accused and other witnesses. Then in those cases, when the magistrate takes cognizance on the charge sheet, then in all those cases, the magistrate cannot order for arrest of the accused after the charge sheet has been filed. This is a clear position of law. There is a judgment to this effect, which says that if during the course of the investigation, the police thought that they don't require to arrest this particular offender, then the court will not ask that offender to be arrested. And therefore, the court will simply issue a summons to the accused person, and the accused person will come before a court of law. And once they come before a court of law, then the trial will start. Now, interestingly, let us also talk about a situation in which this accused does not choose to come before the trial. Probably that accused feels that, he's guilty and he does not want to, expose himself. Therefore, in such cases, that accused can be declared as a proclaimed offender by following the steps which are provided under section 82, which is commonly called in Hindi Bhagoda Ghoshit, is, proclaimed offender under 82. Now, after securing the presence of the accused before a court of law, uh, the uh, the magistrate will commit the entire file to a sessions court, and the sessions court will then uh, you know, take seize of the will be seized with the proceedings of the case and will commence the trial. But very important, fundamentally, remember this, that it is only the magistrate which takes cognizance of an offence. It is never the sessions court. The magistrate will take cognizance of the offence and then commit it to the sessions court on the basis of the imprisonment, on the basis of what is the kind of trial which is stipulated under Schedule 2 of the Code of CRPC. You see, Schedule 1 of the Code of CRPC clearly prescribes what is a cognizable offence, what is a bailable or a non-bailable offence, and by what court it is triable. So usually, if it's a magistrate trial, then magistrate will not have to, commit it to the sessions court. But if it's a sessions court trial, then magistrate will have to commit the same to the sessions court. Now, before I move on to the framing of charge by a court of law, I would like to quickly talk about bail. Now, there are two kinds of bail essentially. There is an anticipatory bail and then there is a regular bail. Now, within the regular bail, there are again two categories. There is a regular bail post-charge sheet and there is a regular bail pre-charge sheet. A regular bail post-charge sheet is relatively easy to get because the lawyer for the accused can always argue that since the investigation is over, hence the accused should be released and there's no purpose in keeping the accused behind the bars. Whereas a pre-charge sheet bail is sometimes difficult because the investigating officer and the public prosecutor submits to the court that investigation is not yet complete, and because the investigation is not yet complete, hence they would not want the investigation to get interfered or impeded in any way, and therefore the accused should be kept behind the bars. Now, bail is granted under three provisions: 437, 438 or 439. 437 talks about a regular bail which can be granted by a magistrate. 438 talks about an anticipatory bail which is granted by a court of sessions or a high court, and 439 talks about a bail which can be granted by the sessions court or by the high court. Now, what is important is that once the bail is granted, once a regular bail is granted, then that bail survives till the end of the trial. So let us say if in India a typical trial takes 5 years and the accused has been, in this case the Y has been behind the bars for 3 to 4 months, then in that case, if Y gets bail from, let us say, the sessions court under 439, then the accused will be at liberty to roam around wherever he wants, subject to the conditions of the bail, for the next 4.5 years till the trial is concluded. And once the trial is concluded, depending on the kind of punishment which he gets, he will be sentenced. He will have to serve the imprisonment, subject to appeal and all those things, obviously. So those were bail provisions. One more important thing is that anticipatory bail is only granted by the session court or the high court, and anticipatory bail can, once granted, will also continue till the end of the trial. This is a question which is pending before the Supreme Court, whether the anticipatory bail should only continue till the filing of the charge sheet in cases where it has been taken before the filing of the charge sheet, and whether the accused should again secure a bail after the filing of the charge sheet. But that question as of now is pending. But the law as on date is that the anticipatory bail shall continue during the course of the entire trial. Now, one also very important thing is what we need to know is the difference between a police custody and a judicial custody. So let us say in this case, Y was arrested on 5 January 2020. When Y was arrested on 5 January 2020, Y, as per the mandate of the CRPC, has to be produced before a magistrate within 24 hours, excluding the transit time, if any. When the investigating officer produces the arrested person before the magistrate, the investigating officer has two options. the investigating officer can ask for a police custody. Usually in a police custody, the accused is kept in the police station itself. The accused is not sent to the local jail, and the jail in this case, in cases of Delhi, in case of Delhi, is usually Tihar jail. So the accused will be kept in the police custody at the police station, and usually police custody is asked by the police in cases where they want some kind of custodial interrogation to be done, and because they can convince the magistrate that there is certain evidence which has not been produced, and because that certain evidence has not seen the light of the day, therefore they would want to kind of gather that from the accused, and they would want to put the accused in police custody. Please remember, everyone, the police custody can only be asked for 15 days. The police custody cannot be asked for more than 15 days. It is only the first 14 days, in fact, 14 days when the police custody can be asked for. After that, the person has to be sent to judicial custody. So if though I get a question from Shivani Singh, so if bail is not granted at first, then the accused automatically gets default bail after. Yes, that is correct. If, let us say, the bail is not granted to Y in this case, and the charge sheet has not been filed within 90 days. So you have to remember that the IO should fail in filing of the charge sheet as well. If the IO actually fails in filing the charge sheet, then yes, 90 days is the maximum time. If the charge sheet is not filed within 90 days, then the accused will get the default bail. And the default bail is as good as regular bail. It cannot be cancelled in normal circumstances, and it will continue till the life of the trial. But one very interesting and important thing which I want to mention out here is that there is a way of circumventing section 167(2), and the investigating officers circumvent 167(2) very commonly, and that way is by filing a piecemeal charge sheet, an incomplete charge sheet, and then asking the court to for permission to file a supplementary charge sheet. And especially in cases where FSL reports are pending, which usually take a longer time, in such cases the investigating officer, and justifiably so, they file a supplementary charge sheet, they file a main charge sheet, and then they seek time from the court to file a supplementary charge sheet later. What does this do? This ensures that the investigating officer does not give a default bail to the accused offender, and at the same time the charge sheet is filed within time, hence meaning that the right of default bail is curtailed to that extent. So moving on now, let's talk about framing of charges. Now, framing of charges is provided under section 228 and 251. Now, we all understand that there are three forms of trials: warrant trial, sessions trial, and summons trial. They can be distinguished on the basis of the parameters provided in the CRPC. I'm sure you guys are aware of that, or you can read it. The charge framed for warrant trial or sessions trial is provided under section 228, and the charge to be framed under 251 is for summons trial. Now, please remember that there is a lot of difference between these three trials, especially at the stage of framing of charge. For instance, in a summons trial, in which the charge or the notice, which is usually, it's not even called a charge, it's called a notice, which is framed under 251. The accused does not have a right to secure a discharge. The accused cannot argue, the counsel for the accused cannot argue and get a discharge on the basis of the argument that there is no prima facie case which has been made out by the prosecutor, or there is no prima facie case which has been made out by the charge sheet. Again, this is a point of a lot of debate, and there are a lot of conflicting judgments on this issue. Some judges have held that no, under 251 also one can argue and get a discharge, but some judges have said that no, under 251 the procedure is not allowing for discharge, it's simply a framing of notice. This is very, very useful, very, very important, because of the large amount of 138 cases which we have in our court system, the check dishonor cases. And these check dishonor cases are essentially summons trial, and therefore, it's very important for you to appreciate the distinction. Usually when the charge is framed and the charge is argued, the counsel for the accused argues the charge on the basis of the prima facie material. The accused now, after some latest judgments, can also introduce his or her set of documents before the court which are of unimpeachable nature. They can be public documents, they can be documents of high credit worthiness, or they can be documents which have already been admitted by the prosecution in the first place. Now, please try and appreciate that the prosecution has the charge sheet on the basis of which they'll get the charge framed. And the court also has to frame the charge on the basis of the charge sheet. But the defense at that stage does not have anything. The counsel for the accused has to primarily rely on the charge sheet and the contents of the charge sheet to show that prima facie case is not being made out. But now, after a recent judgment of the Supreme Court, the law has been made clear that the accused can also introduce some documents at the stage of charge if the documents are of unimpeachable nature and if they are of sterling quality. So, let us say in this case, in the example that we are talking about, the charge has been framed. The accused pleads not guilty because that is what usually the accused does. Plea bargaining is not something which is very prevalent in the Indian court system, practically speaking. So, in all such cases, the accused will plead not guilty, and therefore the trial will commence. When the trial commences, there is a list of witnesses, which is attached along with the charge sheet, and all those witnesses would have given their 161 statements. Now, please remember that when the investigating officer is investigating an offense, he collects all the incriminating material which is related to the offense and also the statements of the witnesses who are relevant to the offense at hand, who might have seen the offense or who might be able to prove some circumstantial evidence against the accused persons. Now, all these statements are 161 statements. They are never signed by the witness. And because they are never signed by the witness, essentially, the witnesses can very well take a different line of approach before a court of law. Because they can always say that, the police coerced us to write this statement and it was not out of a free will. These statements are not admissible in a court of law. They can at best be used by the prosecution or the defense to contradict that particular witness when that particular witness comes in an examination in chief during the prosecution evidence. The statements which are admissible are 164 statements which are given before the local magistrate or the local SDM. And those are usually of the main victim in rape and murder cases. So let us say there were around 8 witnesses in this, or let's say 12 witnesses in this list of witnesses along with the charge sheet. Usually this charge sheet has 2 kinds of witnesses, formal witnesses and material witnesses. Formal witnesses are essentially those witnesses who will only try and prove the basic formalities of a case. Let us say, the arrest memo, the seizure memo, the date of the FIR, the time of the FIR, the contents, basic stuff. And then there are material witnesses, let us say any eyewitness or any important relative of the deceased or any passerby, which is again an eyewitness. So the prosecution has the prerogative to choose the order in which these witnesses will be introduced before a court. Every time a witness comes, that witness will depose by way of an examination in chief, and he or she will be cross-examined by the defense. And in this way, the entire material will be collected in examination in chief. When they give their evidence, they will prove the documents. By proof of documents, I mean they will exhibit the documents. And it will be good as if you as young law students understand the exhibition of a document. The document is only exhibited when the original maker of that document, as per the Evidence Act, comes in a witness box and says that, yes, I made this document. Only then does the document get properly exhibit, or even if it does get exhibit, it can only be properly have been said to be proved when the original maker of the document proves it. Obviously, there are some exceptions to this, like if it's a public document or if it's a document of a certain kind, as per provided under the Indian Evidence Act. So now what we have is we have a lot of incriminating material against Y, a lot of key depositions, cross examinations, and documents against Y to prove the offense that he's committed. And then we move on to the stage of a 313 statement. A 313 statement is a statement under 313 of the CRPC, 313 of the CRPC, which basically means that the magistrate or the sessions court, or whoever is conducting the trial, will put all the incriminating material to the accused by way of questions. So let us say in this case, the question can be, did you slap X after getting completely sloshed or after getting completely inebriated, completely drunk? And then Y will have to give an answer to this. And then, there will be a series of questions on the basis of the incriminating material, which will have to be answered by Y. Last question usually in 313 statements is always that, what do you have to say in your defense? Please try and understand this is a very, very important stage of the trial. As a counsel for the accused, it is your responsibility to explain every incriminating material which stands against you and give a justification to that. And if you're not able to do that, you will not get a chance for that at the appellate or at the stage of the appeal or before an SLP, before the Supreme Court in an SLP. So it is extremely important for you to justify and to give your reasons as to why the incriminating material is not true. And if you, that is a very, very crucial part of this entire trial process. And then after that, the defense evidence comes in. The accused will, the counsel for the accused can bring in 2 witnesses, 3 witnesses, 4 witnesses, any number of witnesses, which the accused feels would depose in their favor and would depose in a true manner. Usual trends are that in Indian criminal justice system, we do not introduce defense witnesses. We let the prosecution win or lose on the basis of their own case, because they have to prove their case to the hilt. They have to prove beyond reasonable doubt. And therefore, we as defense counsels don't want to expose our witnesses to the entire travails of a cross-examination. Because if they're, introduced to the travails of a cross-examination, then in those cases, they can also say things which probably we would not want to get on record. And therefore, either it's very few witnesses or it's no witness at all from the side of the defense. So this is the trial process. Then at the end of it all, there's a final argument which is conducted by both sides, post which the judgment is pronounced of conviction or acquittal. If it is a conviction, then there is a separate date for sentencing usually, on which the arguments are heard on the basis of sentence, because the parameters of a conviction and the parameters of sentence are fairly different, with some overlapping issues or parameters, but more or less it's predominantly kind of different from each other. So that is the life of a criminal trial. I think in a span of, let's say, 50 minutes, we've been able to cover most of the important provisions of our CRPC. And I will be happy to take any questions if there are any.
Right, sir. I think many of the students must have like questions. So I'll be speaking the questions which are there with us. So there's one question by Kartikeya Avasthi. He says that since the law is clear that habitual offenders are to be treated as same as new criminals, so how far this is practical in the real scenario, or can we introduce some exception to right to life for habitual offenders?
Habitual offenders, you see, the point is that habitual offenders are not treated equally under our law, because you will see that when you will apply for bail, you have to write a sentence in your bail application that you have criminal antecedents or you don't have criminal antecedents. And usually when you have criminal antecedents, then your chances of getting a bail is severely reduced. So that is one difference. Secondly, when a habitual offender is convicted in another offense and he is put to sentencing, then the sentencing court will always take care of, will always consider the antecedents of the habitual offender, and on that basis pronounce a sentence. And that sentence will definitely be more aggravated if the offender in question has committed many offenses in the past.
All right, sir. There was one question from Rohan Chauhan. He says that what is the difference between the parallel medical examinations and technical examinations with special reference to section 53 and 311A of the CRPC?
Let me see 53, because this is not a question. This is not something which is fairly common in practice. But I'll quickly try and see 53. Why don't we do this? Why don't we request you to write to us the specific questions, the ones which are not in practice on an everyday basis, and we will, send you the answers. But from the looks of it, it is fairly clear that in cases in which a medical practitioner is being requested by the police officer, then the same will be provided. But this is a very specific question. We can always give you a specific answer to that. But to just give you a brief kind of an idea of how exactly all this works, is that whenever an offender, whenever a victim has been committed, has suffered a crime, then in those cases the victim is taken to a hospital, usually a government hospital, that prepares an MLC, and on that basis of an MLC, the FIR is lodged. But I believe in this question, in this section, the section talks about the accused being examined by a medical practitioner. So I need to understand the context in which this question is asked. So if that specific question can be sent, we will be happy to answer.
Just a moment, we'll find if he's there or not.
Yeah, if Rohan is there, we can have a word with him, and I'll be happy to explain to him.
I think he has left or something.
No issues, no issues.
Right. So moving forward, sir. Generally, what this is my question after observing your session. So, what options does one has with oneself that if a police refuses to file an FIR, and similarly when the magistrate delays the procedure under section 153 CRPC, 156 3 CRPC, then what relief can be sought if the magistrate is delaying that particular matter, like let's say for example investigation or
no. So basically, you see, the point is that if, let us say, an FIR is lodged but the investigation is being delayed by the investigating officer, let us say he's not arresting the accused, he's taking 2 years to file the charge sheet or 2 years to get things moving, then in all such cases you can file an application before the local magistrate saying that the investigating officer is not properly functioning, therefore the investigating officer may be replaced, or the investigating officer may be given a strict timeline on the basis of which he or she should complete the investigation, or in general expedite the investigation. And if the magistrate also does not give you an order, you can always approach the High Court under 482 of the CRPC, and the High Court will intervene, and if they find enough grounds, they will tell for an expedited kind of an investigation. Now, I've got a question here which says, if the police takes suo motu cognizance and files an FIR, can the relatives go to the police station and revise or enhance the FIR with more facts? That's a very interesting question. So the answer to this is that the FIR will be lodged. The FIR is not supposed to be an encyclopedia of all the facts. The FIR is only a preliminary kind of a report which is lodged on the basis of preliminary facts. FIR is always continuing in nature, and therefore during the course of the investigation, the relatives in such case, where the police has lodged the FIR suo motu, the relatives in such case can give their statements and give their evidence, of which knowledge will be taken, action will be taken by the local police, and therefore the purpose of the relatives will be solved. So Anmol, I think we are done with all the questions. I think we are done with all the concepts.
Right, sir. Right. There was a similar question. Just one doubt
please.
I received, and that was in the recent. Let's say if you everybody is observing the Riya Chakraborty's case in the NDPS matter. Basically, if an FIR is lodged under the Indian Penal Code, then 164 CRPC, we can the 161 CRPC confessions can they can be a person can choose a different path before the court of law. But
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
but let's say, for example, in the NDPS Act, where the NDPS officers are provided with special powers, they are in certain circumstances they are themselves, let's say for example, the confessions are maintainable under the NDPS Act. So what remedy does the accused have with himself or herself to, or what I think Riya Chakraborty has with herself after like the confessions?
Sure. So, that's again a very valid point. There are special laws in India which have very different kind of, criminal, very different ingredients. They're very different from CRPC in a lot of ways. One of them being that, the statements given by the witnesses and the accused is admissible before a court of law. But please remember, firstly, these statements, to the extent that they incriminate the accused themselves, will be hit by Article 20 of the Constitution. So the famous Miranda rule, which we have imported from the US, they will be hit by Article 20. So only to a limited extent they can be proved before a court of law. You can't take the entire statement made to the NDPS authorities and prove it before a court of law, because I'm sure that portions of it will be hit by Article 20, and therefore a court of law which has a decent understanding of the Constitution of India will not be able to admit those statements. Secondly, please remember that the courts understand that how Indian police functions and how special authorities function under the ED or under the PMLA Act, under the NDPS Act, and therefore the court will only give limited weightage to such confessions. Rest assured that these confessions will not make or break the case, because they are confessions which are made before the police, and unless there is a recovery pursuant to that confession will hold limited value. And remember, Section 27 of the Indian Evidence Act. Section 27 of the Indian Evidence Act clearly mentions that if there is a recovery pursuant to a confession, then that confession becomes valid and admissible in a court of law. So, yeah.
Right. Sir, this is, I think this would be the last question which every student must like in his own life. I think this question is a necessary question, and that is, there is generally a stigma attached to this criminal litigation, and that is that in the early days in the criminal litigation one does not get to earn a lot as compared to the corporate in the corporate sector or as a corporate associate. So how a law student should convince himself or herself to opt for this very field?
So there is an answer to this. I even though I completed my master's in criminal law, in criminal justice from Oxford, I was fairly clear that I'm not going to restrict myself to criminal law. And I genuinely feel that everyone who loves the subject should not restrict himself or herself in the first 10 years of their career. They should take up everything. They should consciously do 50% of their work in criminal law. So let us say if you have a lot of paid civil law briefs, then you should work on equal number of unpaid criminal law briefs with some good senior, or in whatever way, or read criminal law judgments for 50% of your time, because only then will you be able to gain knowledge and the practical experience towards the subject. But what is important is that you don't only dedicate yourself to criminal law, because it is very true that in the first 5 to 7 years, and probably 10 years also in some cases, the money which comes in criminal law practice is fairly less, but then it gets compensated. Once you make a name out of your, out of your criminal law practice, you make a lot of money. There is another school of thought which says that right from the beginning you concentrate on criminal law and don't do anything else, which also has its own merits and demerits. In that school of thought, you are able to build a name more quickly. So yeah, that will be the answer. I have just one last question here which I can answer, and then I think we can close the session. And this is a personal question. We filed an FIR 5 years for a house robbery. 5 years passed. We didn't receive any closure report or any development took place. What are our options? You need to approach the magistrate, the local magistrate, with an application wherein you will ask the local magistrate to direct the IO to give a status report of the investigation which has happened, and whether the closure report has been filed or the charge sheet has been filed or whatever has been done. And once you do this, then the magistrate will monitor the investigation and take it to either a closure report or a charge sheet. You can do this under 156 again of the CRPC by moving an application to the local magistrate.
All right. All right. Sir, any question that you would have, you would like to tell, which is a good kind of question?
No, I would just say that, whoever is interested in litigation, first of all, only enter into litigation if you have the passion for the subject. Money will follow. In litigation, money always follows, but you need to be having a passion for the subject. You need to have that flair for the subject, that kind of, in internal likeness towards the subject. Also, one very important thing which I want to mention to everyone is that read for 7 to 8 hours every single day of your life. If you're training to be a lawyer, that is the only way in which you can become a good lawyer. Unless and until you read, you will not be able to, you have to have that reading habit. You have to have a good reading speed, and you have to have a good comprehension to become a competent lawyer. And always remember that it is a long run game, but every single day of your life in a litigation career is an enjoyable day. You will come back to your house and really enjoy, because you're always surrounded with good action and good kind of, knowledgeable stuff.
All right. All right. Thank you so much, sir. Your experiences, I have jotted down the points, but I think that we will communicate in our official communique. So thank you so much,
Okay.
sir,
Thank
for
you.
joining us. I think everybody in the School of Law, it's just amazing to hear from you. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you. All the best, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much.
I have one more question, which is,
Yes.
I would just quickly, in practical life, isn't being a criminal lawyer a risky choice? Not at all. It is not at all a risky choice. And the simple answer to that is just turn out the papers and see how many criminal lawyers have been hurt or shot. You will hardly find 5 to 10 lawyers in the history of Indian criminal law practice who've been, affected like this. I mean, more people die out of a plane crash. The probability to die out of a plane crash is higher. So it's not at all risky. Okay.
Thank you so
All
much,
right,
sir.
guys. Bye.
Thank you so much for your valuable.
Bye. Bye.